One of the things I've always loved about Henry Crowell's approach is that I think it's so reflective of the commitment of Jesus to call us to a whole life discipleship. So it's not about a piece of our life or some of our ideas or some of our actions, but really this comprehensive sense that we're called to be disciples and we're called to do the things that reflect that we are disciples. And Henry clearly understood that to the core. So when I think about working with students, whether it was at the University of California for years and years, or whether it's now as the president of Fuller Seminary, I'm really aware of the significance of call being encompassing and comprehensive. It's as much about our character per se as it is about certain skills or abilities or gifts that we may have been given. And I think all of that is consonant with Henry's own grasp of what we were called to be and to do. And it's one of the reasons why his life and ministry has been so consonant with Fuller's, because I think both of us are trying to have an expression of faith and life that's consonant with the teaching of the New Testament. What strikes me about Henry's story is actually its pain. That's the primary thing that first strikes me about his story. The number of ways, especially in his early life, his childhood, and in his marriage, and in his family, and the sequence of deaths and other tragedies that he experienced, were clearly really formative. And part of the reason why the gospel landed with such power in his life was that he realized that the gospel actually intersected in the pain. So what I read when I have read Henry's story is a person who has lived in that reality and then discovered the reality of a gospel that landed in the places of pain in our life, where we could actually, by God's grace, discover ways that God himself could bring good out of that kind of suffering. So he didn't deflect pain, he wasn't insensitive to it, and a lot of the work that he had that shaped his company and a lot of the philanthropy that has gone on as a consequence of the wealth that he developed is a manifestation of the ability to bring these things together. So the sensitivity to vulnerability, the desire for, of course, for evangelism, for people to hear the good news of the gospel, to land in its fullness in people's lives, for it to be a global gospel, for it to be a gospel that was for people of all tribes and tongues and nations, that it was a gospel that landed in places of acute vulnerability, not just of strength. Then along comes his parallel gift, which was his capacity for business and his ability to think creatively around things that hadn't even really been existent at the time that he began his work, both the development of the product line of Quaker Oats, but also the marketing that he developed, the way that was launched by somebody who was not speaking because it was the lingua franca of his day, but because he was actually making it up out of instincts. But what was he doing? He was doing it for really ordinary people. It was for people that might only be able to afford, let's say, oatmeal for breakfast. And there is, I think, even in that, a capacity to understand and identify with real human beings in real places. What happened was that he gave his whole life to Christ, and he realized in the context of his own suffering, pain, and vulnerability that he needed a God who was exactly the God that he discovered Jesus to be revealing. And then along comes a particular pathway of enacting his discipleship, which came about first in his work, but also in his philanthropy. And so to me, I would say that journey is really common. That if people find their calling, I would say most of the time they find their calling first because of receiving the full life calling of being owned body, mind, soul, and strength to the God of the universe made known in Jesus Christ. And then they ask the questions, but what am I to do with what I've been given? And it's out of that then that God sometimes gives people a very specific sense of call. But I would say in many ways, it's fundamentally still primarily a call to character and to being and doing God, the life of God in the world, not just the tasks of ministry or the roles of ministry or the role of responsibility that we may be given. So I think that follows secondarily. If you turn it around, then you're really in crisis, where you have a theology that only supports God causing me to do a certain thing in the world, as opposed to a God who holds all things And that includes the whole of my life. I think we're in an era when the church is in dramatic crisis, especially in the United States, but in many, many places around the world. This is a moment that I do believe, actually, we will look back on and say that was an inflection point, unlike most inflection points that seem in their own terms dramatic. I think we're in the middle of something more dramatic than that and more profound than that, that is a convergence of many things. We have to have a comprehensive gospel. It has to be a holistic gospel. It has to be a gospel for every dimension of life and for every kind of person in every kind of circumstance. And the church is showing itself, tragically, to often be specialists in certain sociologies, certain social settings, certain racial contexts, certain political contexts. That is a very serious crisis because that narrowing is exactly, in my view, the opposite of the instincts of Jesus. So to the degree that the Crowell Trust and Henry himself becomes an inspiration for a much more comprehensive gospel that actually asks every hard question, that does not in any way turn away from pain and suffering, that moves toward it with an instinct that the gospel offers hope and creativity and recreation as a gift of the love of Jesus Christ and the power of the Holy Spirit and the teachings of the scriptures, that is transformative. So to me, Henry's vision of this comprehensive gospel that then lands in creative spaces that can reinvent things. And I think this is where his business matches his philanthropy, where he literally takes what was already present, but then actually, in a way, gathers it literally into a carton, a cardboard carton that can hygienically present a product that was there all along. But now suddenly, it's as though oatmeal just got invented, when in fact, oats were there the whole time, and the utility of it was there all the time. But the ability to receive it, to actually receive what it was and what it meant, was something that was not yet seen, I think, as fully as he allowed it to be. I think the same thing is true in the moment that we're in. How does the church not reduce the gospel? How does the church allow the gospel to be the full gospel and then make it known in such a way as to crack open reality, not to shut it down, and to believe that the God who owns all things is the God who cares deeply about all things and all people. And it's into that context where people of every generation need to discover and know that reality. And I think for so many people, especially young adults and youth that are disaffected with the church, I'm disaffected with the church. I mean, there's enormous reasons to find the church problematic. What's the gift is that there's a greater answer than the church. The church was never itself the salvation. It is the God of the church who can actually even reinvent the church, which is, I think, the era that we're in, and where the work and inspiration of someone like Henry can be so significant, and where young people understanding this can actually have their own generational moment of reclaiming, rediscovering, redisplaying, and reenacting the gospel in the world. Now that is world-changing, and I think Henry would agree.